In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about ancient astronomy. Now, we have to notice that every culture around the world seems to have a very accurate knowledge of ancient astronomy. Even up to this day, some of the cultures have retained this sacred information where high priests and various other pieces of their civilization recorded movements of the heavens over thousands of years. So what we're going to look at today is some of the actual physical evidence that shows this astronomical knowledge and why, perhaps, they were tracking the movements of the heavens over thousands of years. Now, one of the key places to start is to look at some of the megalithic monuments that we have all over the earth. So let's go ahead and dive in here. If we look at, for instance, Stonehenge, obviously there's been all kinds of modern academic theories as to what Stonehenge was being used for, but then there's also the other side of that explanation, which is to try and explain how such a megalithic monument could have been built. Stacking these stones in such a way would require, mechanics that would allow them to transport and then upright move these stones into position, let alone explaining the ones that they have balanced on top of these megalithic structures. But when we know for pretty much a fact today that Stonehenge seems to be a type of astronomical marker, it allows one to look at the current solstices, the summer and winter solstices, and see when certain alignments take place to mark these specific times. Now, what's really interesting here is that, again, aside from the construction of these stones, what we also have is a very accurate celestial clock, if you will, monitoring the heavens so that when certain alignments take place with the heavens and the earth, there are these markers that pinpoint that exact time. So it's very interesting to realize that the ancients were aware of a larger cycle of time, but used these megalithic monuments in tracking their astronomical positions to know when they're at certain points, when certain alignments are taking place. This was kind of like a grand celestial clock. It repeats. Everything that we see in nature repeats. The seasons, night, day, the calendar, everything is repeating. So a lot of the things that we're going to look at is this knowledge of astronomical movements that, again, was sacred information to them because they were able to see when these repeating points would come into fruition. Now, Stonehenge today is obviously still visited by quite a bit of people, and we reminisce as to when this was an actual completed circle and what its true function was for. But clearly it was being used as an astronomical outpost to mark certain positions as to when Earth came into alignment, the winter solstice, the summer solstice. So very interesting information. Now, what we also have are observations of the heavens that come from various cultures around the world, various times and epochs that spread a vast distance of our history, but share in a similar line of thinking and research, tracking certain stars in the heavens. You can see that this manuscript is basically found in Timbuktu, and it was an ancient Islamic form of, again, recording the heavens, the movements of the heavens, over thousands of years. This disc is quite interesting. It was located in ancient Germany, and a lot of times these certain depictions of what we would think to be either the sun and the moon or various astronomical symbols, we see them carried over from various cultures that did not have direct contact with each other, but have similar astronomical observations, looking at certain areas in the sky, making the same type of conclusions about what those planets were, and even giving them similar names. So we really have to wonder if there wasn't a more distant knowledge base, some ancient civilization that did influence all the ancients we know of today, Mayans and Toltecs, Egyptians, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamian. They all seem to have similar pieces of this astronomical base of data that really kind of boggles the mind. Now, this is a pretty infamous artifact known as the Antikythera mechanism, and it was found by some sponge divers in 1901 off the island of Antikythera, just near Greece there. Now, they theorized that this is probably over 2,000 years old. The only thing that they can possibly attribute to building it was maybe the great Greek mathematician and philosopher Archimedes. But we don't know for sure who actually built this device. What we do know is that under radar, it shows between 35 and 70 different cogs and wheels intricately connected and working together. It's theorized that, as an analogy, that it's more complicated than a modern-day Swiss watch. So we're looking at a type of computerized device, if you will, that's possibly at least 2,000 years old. Now, the Antikythera mechanism, we know that was probably used for two devices. It seemed to be like in a box and could be used for astronomical purposes, so that if you were a ship captain, you could use the Antikythera mechanism and tune it towards a certain star or a point in space, and then use that as a way to navigate through the seas. You could also use it as an astrological device, so that if you knew that you were born on July 4th and that Mars was in alignment with you at that time of your birth, they would use the Antikythera mechanism to look and see what's likely to happen within your lifetime by looking at the alignments of what other planets and things happen within your birth date. So very interesting information where the ancients put a lot more emphasis and interest into looking into these devices that use the heavens to deduce information, as well as, again, navigational purposes. One thing I'd like to point out, which is kind of off the topic of Antikythera mechanism, is it's interesting to note that in some of the biblical references, like when the three kings, the three great magi, are coming to see baby Jesus, the story is that they used a star in the sky, the North Star, to navigate their way to find baby Jesus. That is logically not possible. A star is not a fixed point in the sky. If I started off on a journey over 3 weeks going towards the North Star is going to be continually moving throughout the night as the Earth's rotation is taking place. So maybe it wasn't a North Star. Maybe it was something else floating in the sky that was leading them to Jesus. I only bring that up because we have to realize that when we look at things like the Antikythera mechanism, where they were using this as an astronomical device to chart the heavens, maybe these three magi were actually in tune with the North Star and tracking its movements, but were using it with some type of assisted technology to make an accurate notation for where the movements would take the North Star in our radius of view. So very interesting to notice that throughout ancient times we put great emphasis on the astronomical knowledge as well as the astrological, the meaning of what these alignments took place in your lifetime. Now, another culture obviously that had great significance in astronomical data is the Sumerian culture. Not just talking about the Anunnaki and Nibiru or Planet X, the Sumerians had very accurate astronomical data. Now, I must say that in this one-cylinder seal, we do actually see a representation of the 7 dots of Earth and our crescent moon, and then the symbol of a cross for Nibiru and its crescent moon, North Wind, as we know that the classic interaction recorded in some of the Sumerian creation tales, that Nibiru, a planet that they symbolize as a glowing cross, and it had a large crescent moon, did strike our primitive Earth, which is represented as 7 dots, and we also have a moon. So there is some Sumerian information that is, again, collaborative about the Nibiru story, but what we're going to look into is just the basic knowledge of their astronomy from an academic level to prove that they are saying things of veracity. Most Sumerian tablets were written in a clay tablet like you see here, and then they would fire that into a kelm, a primitive stove, literally keying that phrase, writing in stone. And you can see that their system of writing was quite interesting. They used an oversized screwdriver and turn it and twist it in the wet clay to make these characters. But the Sumerians recorded astronomical data, sometimes on semi-precious stones, as well as clay tablets. But this was sacred information. This was only passed down by the high priests over hundreds of years. We might have seen in that movie Apocalypto by Mel Gibson that at one point where there's just about to be a solar eclipse, the priest looks over at the king and kind of nods. Now it's time, for the sacrificial offering. And just before that, now the king stands up and commands the solar eclipse to take place. Excuse me, yes, the solar eclipse. So again, this was sacred knowledge where they knew when these alignments, when they would know when eclipses and things like that were going to happen, because they observed these events and then recorded it as sacred information, knowing that these cycles repeat. So a lot of the Sumerian information actually talks about the movements of the heavens, the distance between the planets, what our planets look like as if you were in space. And again, our sciences, when we started to send space probes out there, confirm the Sumerian descriptions. So a lot of this information, our sciences can now collaborate as being accurate. They were making accurate astronomical observations thousands of years ago. Now the kicker to this is there are probably still thousands of tablets in the British Museum, in the Louvre, in Turkey, in Germany. We literally have thousands of Sumerian tablets that are still yet to be translated. Could still have further sacred data, either on astronomical or maybe even medical knowledge, certain herbs and things that when applied to the human flesh cure disease. I mean, who knows? But as far as the ancient astronomy goes, there are still a wealth of thousands of tablets yet to be translated, sitting in these various archives and museums. You know, museums have thousands of artifacts, and they only rotate on display certain showcases. Sometimes it's there for a month, then it's put away for a year, and then brought back. So a lot of these tablets and things literally have not even seen the light of day yet. Now, various Sumerian tablets and edifices that have these pictogram pieces of information talk about astronomical movements. This one actually has symbols, astronomical symbols, encoded into the stone. Signs of the zodiac, the 12 constellations of the zodiac. This was literally used as an ancient celestial clock. It turns out over 30 cultures, according to the book Hamlet's Mill. Thank you, Walter Cruttenden from the Binary Research Institute. But this book, Hamlet's Mill, talks about over 30 cultures that are aware of this possible dual sun, that we have a binary orbit. And this is the reason why we have this large celestial time, this cycle of 24,000 years. Now, you've heard me talk about this in other lessons, and I'm going to continue to bring this up. The lost cycle of time. Plato called it the Great Year. The Hindus and ancient Vedic texts speak of something called the cycle of the Yugas, where they broke down this division of the heavens into 12 parts as a grand celestial clock. Now today we call it the precession of the equinox. But be very clear that the same thing that we're trying to figure out today, why we see a different constellation every 2,000 years, this precession of the equinox, was clearly known to the ancients. They were very clear and built all of these monuments to mark where they were in this large cycle of time. So what we see is an unbelievable display all over the earth of very accurate astronomical observations. The idea that their ancient astronomy to them was sacred knowledge and literally affected the motions and movements and courses of their lives. And so if we look all over Mesoamerica, we can see monuments that are in great detail used as astronomical outposts, astronomical markers, places of worship, but also places of understanding these alignments. Just like in Chichen Itza, the grand serpent of Kukulkan, this pyramid, forms the shape of a serpent using a shadow by just having the sun hit it at a perfect angle once a year that causes this effect. So we do have to realize that a lot of the information, the mathematical knowledge, for instance, using the number 0, where did these things come from? A lot of it starts off with their understanding of astronomy. And the kicker is that if you ask a lot of these ancient cultures, where did you learn this sacred mathematical knowledge? Where did you learn this sacred astronomical data? We were taught this by the gods, or that it was taught by sacred information that's been passed down of thousands of years. So when we look at South America and we look at these, various pyramids, this was made infamous in Eric von Daniken's movie Chariots of the Gods, where he looked at the planets and realized that the various planets and the names that we have, sun, moon, that here in Mexico we have a collection of pyramids that seem to mimic our own solar system, and that each one, the pyramid of the sun, the pyramid of the moon, actually correspond to planets within our solar system. It's not possible that ancient man could have just made this up. There has to be some connection here with their knowledge in this advanced astronomy. Excuse me. Now, we do see that various cultures, again, created calendar systems, systems of repeating time that were based on astronomical movements. The Mayans obviously were infamous for this. But many people might not realize that there were actually 3 different calendars used by the Mayans. They had a system of calendar that allowed them to predict everyday events, a calendar of time for their lives, and then a much longer cycle of time called a series of baktuns, or predictions, that would be made over longer cycles of time in this 24,000-year cycle. So it boggles modern science today as to how the Mayans could talk about these future dates, or saying that in 2012 time ends and restarts. We don't understand that. But just understand that some of the predictions of the Mayans on these long count calendars, these baktuns, weren't always perfect. Meaning, in one of the future baktuns, they predicted that their god Kukulkan was going to return. And at the same time frame for when this prediction was made to take place, who shows up? The conquistadors. The conquistadors show up in their ships wearing all their armor, and the Mayans think that this is the returning gods, the Kukulkan. They don't understand. So what do? They open up their Maya civilization to them, give them all their gold and Aztec jewelry, and even lost cities of gold like El Dorado, possibly cities literally made of gold. And what happens? The Spanish conquistadors aggressively convert all the Mayans to Christianity and burn all of their codices, all of this lost sacred astronomical data. We have 4 codices left, and that's where you hear things about the Mayan calendar and their extensive knowledge. But there is a lot of lost data, a lot of lost knowledge. And it seems like most of the ancient cultures that we revere today all speak of some lost culture. I'm not going to call them Atlantis or Atlanteans, because they weren't something that sunk into the ocean. They were all over the planet, affecting all the great civilizations, having trade or apprenticeship with the Egyptians, the Mayans, the Aztecs, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia, China, the Hindus, Vedic texts. They all seem to have this same knowledge base of astronomical data that predates them. So again, looking at South America, you can clearly see monuments that were literally built as observatories, just like we have today, right? It would be a large circular dome that opens up for a telescope to make observations. That's the same thing that we're seeing in edifices from ancient cultures. They went to great lengths to build astronomical outposts where they made very accurate astronomical observations. And they didn't have city lights and power grids affecting their view of the heavens. They had very clear observations of the sky. Now, what we see over and over again is this knowledge of the breakdown of the heavens into 12 constellations. Why? What does this mean? Well, if we understand that most of the megalithic monuments were built to align to certain points in time and space, this is shown over and over again with megalithic monuments. Now, Giza obviously is the perfect example. When we look at the satellite of the Giza Plateau, we see that the pyramids are literally perfectly aligned, except for this one's slightly offset. Well, that's just like the 3 pyramids, the 3 stars of Orion's belt, perfectly in alignment. The third one slightly offset. Giza is a terrestrial map of Orion, and this alignment takes place in 10,500 BC. We can further know that this date is accurate because at that same time frame, 10,500 BC, the Sphinx is looking directly east into the constellation of Leo, the lion. The 3 pyramids of Giza are perfectly aligned with the Orion constellation in the heavens. There is a terrestrial alignment marking 10,500 BC as some type of significance. Now, other areas in Giza, again, had this knowledge of what the skies look like thousands of years before the Egyptians were supposedly here in 2500 BC building the pyramids. Why were the pyramids, if they were built in 2500 BC, aligned to the heavens 8,000 years before that in 10,500 BC? Well, they either had knowledge of their civilization going much further back, or they themselves go much further back. Even the inner walls of the Sphinx, you can see the little tiny blow up of the Sphinx right there. The inner walls of the Sphinx, here's the Sphinx, they show extensive weathering on these walls. It's been inundated by water, massive rain flowing and causing these rain geological evidence on the inner walls of the Sphinx. Last time it was raining on the plateaus of Giza was 10,000 years ago. Now, if we look at other areas in Egypt, specifically Dendera, amazing astronomical data is found there, as well as some technological reliefs. Notice this symbol of the winged disk, very prominent on the entrance. Dendera has a clear representation of astronomical symbols. Most specifically is this Dendera wall relief, literally on the ceiling. Inscribed on the ceiling shows a view of constellations that were in view of the sky 8,000 years before they were supposedly around. We're talking at around 8,000 BC, having wall reliefs and things that denote information, astronomical views of the heavens, where the Egyptians weren't even supposed to have been there. Yet they have very clear astronomical plates, this Dendera wall relief, and this is the actual relief. You can see the detail that they went in inscribing this onto the ceiling. But they're talking about constellations. They're talking about movements of the heavens, a view of the sky from thousands of years before the Egyptian culture should have even have existed. So we have to understand that this information can't just be by chance. It can't just be, as the academics would say, they were star worshippers and built a monument that aligns to a star and leave it at that. No. This is a very serious topic. They went to great lengths to build these alignments because it's a repeating cycle that takes place. Now, most of the astronomical movements today we can understand. This larger cycle of time, this great year, is something that's very hard for us to conceive of simply because of the length of time. A 24,000 year cycle. Very hard for us to comprehend. But these ancient cultures went to great lengths to convey visual information about what was taking place in their time and the significance of tracking these moments in time that repeat. Okay, so if we look at other areas in Egypt, this is called Nabta Playa. This is possibly one of the oldest locations that are being used as, again, a type of primitive Stonehenge, a way to use the shadows and the markers to mark various movements in the heavens. Now, we have to understand that there are these three cycles of time. Two of them are a lot easier for us to understand, but this larger 24,000 year cycle is still hard for us to comprehend. But the ancients seem to have had a much firmer grasp on this knowledge. We'll have to look into this further as we do these lessons and looking at this lost cycle of time. The Egyptians, again, are one of the few cultures that really provide us this lost base of knowledge, where they had boats that talk about taking the soul into the next life. Literally, the Egyptian Book of the Dead is like 800 pages, and it talks about how the pharaoh would prepare in their lifetime, or a Mayan king. Various other cultures had similar ways of preparing the soul for the travel into the afterlife. And it always involved going into the heavens, going into the stars. It's almost as if they had some type of a knowledge that, the Mayans talked about where the king would have to pass through certain doorways and interact with certain beings. Egyptians, the same thing in their Egyptian Book of the Dead, talk about these various things that they have to do to carry their kingship into the next life by having this sacred knowledge taught to them in this life. Again, the worship and knowledge of the Son. We hear this term, the Son of God, for Jesus Christ, the Son of God. All cultures worshipped the sun, the actual sun, the disk. So this is the life-giving force, and it's very interesting to realize that not only did they pay attention to astronomical movements, but gave great reverence to various stars and things like our own sun. So the Egyptians, I think, are really a great culture for us to look at, the acronyms and hieroglyphic information, where they're conveying a much deeper understanding of knowledge than we could convey in a written text. Remember, a picture is always worth 1,000 words. The Egyptians were very astute at using hieroglyphic visuals. You know, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, FYI, for your information. Those 3 letters, FYI, we know mean several different words. The Egyptians were the same way. They used hieroglyphic imagery to represent many different words. This tells a much deeper story than we could with a written word. So we have to realize that some of these symbolic references of the sun, understanding that they didn't have telescopes or knowledge of advanced equations and math, yet they made accurate astronomical observations without the aid of technology. Observations that are not possible without the aid of technology. The Dogon tribe in Africa, understanding that they could see Sirius A and B, that it was 2 suns, 2 separate suns, one bigger, one smaller, in an orbit around each other, are always depicted accurately. And interestingly enough, some of the Dogon hieroglyphics, which I'm going to call them that, are very similar in alignment with Egyptian cosmology, Egyptian symbology, completely separate continents, Africa, Egypt, thousands of years in difference in culture. The people, the Dogon tribe in Africa, still cut off from civilization today, but having accurate symbols, sharing cosmology. Again, the 3 belt stars of Orion, aligning with the pyramids. The Dogon tribe in Africa, clearly giving representations of Sirius A and B in the Orion constellation. And these are primitive people, even today, that retain this sacred astronomical data and pass it down through their cultures. When it gets into the hands of modern science, we go, wait a minute, how is this possible that thousands of years ago they were making accurate astronomical observations? So this really raises a lot of questions about Sirius A and B and various other planet systems that we have out there. Was this information given to the ancient man because gods literally came from those points in space? The Orion constellation, Sirius A and B? What if there are other planets that orbit the suns for Sirius A and B? It's even possible that Sirius A and B are our second binary sun. Now, these are topics we're not going to explore in today's lesson, but the answers lie in the heavens. Looking at the astronomical data is really going to give us new information as we start to further understand our sciences. Petroglyphs and things that go back thousands of years make these representations of astronomical data, observations of the heavens, and sometimes things, beings that came down from the heavens while they were making these observations. So it's very interesting to note that, again, over 30 cultures talk about this reference of dual suns. So the 24,000-year cycle that we have today, known as the precession of the equinox, they actually say it's a little over 26,000 years. But, as we're going to find out through more recent data and studying these ancient cultures, the precession of the equinox is more tightly seen as a 24,000-year cycle, caused by the binary orbit of our 2 suns. Now, we haven't yet proven that we have 2 suns, but all the other solar systems that we're looking at external from ours are binary. They have at least 2 suns. So it's very possible that just as all these ancient cultures, over 30, as written about in Hamlet's Mill, talk about the idea of this dual sun orbit, this is possibly what's causing this rise and fall of civilizations here on Earth. Everyone's heard of the Golden Age. Everyone's heard of the Dark Ages. That's a repeating cycle, a 24,000-year cycle. 12,000 years of going into the Golden Age and 12,000 years descending out of the Golden Age. And it repeats. I think the reason why is because we're in a binary orbit. It's very possible that our suns, the energy from our sun, the reason why the Egyptians and all these various cultures worship the energy of the sun, the life-giving force, is that if we're a binary system, when the suns are at their closest point in orbit, the energy coincides with us being in the golden age. We reach a point where we're able to interpret God. That's pretty heavy. That's what's talked about in these ancient Mahabharata and ancient Vedic texts. So when the suns are at their farthest points, we're in the dark ages. It's kind of like HBO's Game of Thrones. We forget all of the sacred knowledge and interaction with these higher beings, and it becomes more just a physical reality. Well, we're finding more of a balance. And I think that it's interesting to realize that all these ancient cultures were aware of this cycle of time. It's not a linear thing. We were ever so simplistic and are going to become more ever so complex. It's a cycle that's repeating. Now, through that cycle, there are gradual, probably evolutionary cycles even beyond this 24,000 one. But that's pretty heavy in itself, understanding that there's a 24,000 year cycle of evolution, which is repeating here on Earth. So we can really look back at a lot of these ancient texts, the Mahabharata and Vedic texts, talking about times that go back 10,000 years. And again, they have this knowledge of this sacred astronomy. We really need to pay closer attention to this information. And I love this analogy that, there's an insect here on Earth that only lives 24 hours. So we're talking about a 24,000 year cycle. In comparison to us and living 100 years, here's an insect that lives 24 hours. So if a mayfly is born on a cloudy day, no sunlight, and another mayfly comes up and says, I've heard this rumor of sunshine and a breeze, but they don't see it, and they die on that same cloudy day. That doesn't mean that the sun or that the wind does not exist. So in our 24,000 year cycle here on Earth, just because we live a small fraction of time, doesn't mean that we can't further comprehend what all these ancient cultures seem to be aware of, this lost cycle of time that affects our rise and fall of civilization here on Earth.